Today is August 25th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues to unfold. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk has predictably left Ukrainian forces severely overextended, admittedly accelerating the advance of Russian forces along the actual line of contact, along which the war is actually unfolding. Let's start by taking a look at the map, and then let's get into Western media admissions that all of this that was very predictable from the very beginning, from the moment Ukraine committed to its Kursk incursion. This is now all being admitted by the Western media, citing US officials. So let's look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map. Keep that in mind as we take a look. We can see the Kursk incursion up here in the north, the northeast. The actual line of contact goes from Kherson, across Zaporozhye, the Donbas region, and of course Kharkov region near Kupiansk. There's also this additional front Russia had opened up relatively recently north of Kharkov city. If we look along the actual line of contact, especially west of Donetsk and Avdiivka, we can see that Russian forces have been advancing, even in just the 1 week since my last update. Now, this map has a timeline feature right here. You can see it provides information as of August 24th. If we go back about a week, let's say 17th of August, you can see that this area was yet to be under Russian control. This pro-Ukrainian map admits that yes, Russian forces have continued to advance. They have now reached this area. They continue moving to Pokrovsk. Now, the Western media is talking more and more about Pokrovsk because it is inevitably going to be taken by Russian forces. It's another one of these important logistical hubs that is being used to help support the rest of Ukrainian defenses along the line of contact. Russia taking this is going to further grind down Ukrainian military capabilities, including military logistics. So this is a really important development. Let's see what else is going on along the line of contact. Let's go up to Kursk, this incursion. Let's look at the developments over the past week here. We can see this is the extent to which not that Ukrainian forces hold and are defending territory, but the areas where Ukrainian forces are still operating and fighting Russian forces. About a week ago, you can see that they have made some progress moving here toward the west. And you can see there's a small river running through here. Ukraine has been targeting bridges, including pontoon bridges that Russia has been constructing. They're trying to isolate Russian forces here, drive them out, and add this to the area that they are holding. But if you are already admittedly overextending yourself by committing to this incursion in the first place, the more territory that you take and try to hold, the more difficult it will be, the more overstretched your logistics will be, and the more it will cost you along the actual line of contact. We will get into all of that in just a moment. There's one more point I want to make by looking at the map. Let's refresh it and look down here around the Kerch Strait, the Kerch Bridge. Ukraine continues attempting to attack and destroy the bridge. They're also trying to target the ports between the rest of Russia and Kerch, the port here in Kerch. And this is actually how Russia had been supplying all of Crimea before the bridge was constructed in 2018 and before the land bridge along here was established in 2022. The problem is we see attacks like this happen maybe once or twice a month. They will attack the port once or twice a month. They will try to attack the bridge maybe once or twice a month. There might be a ship, a ferry that is attacked, severely damaged or destroyed every other month. This is not nearly frequent enough or on a scale large enough to disrupt Russia's ability to supply Crimea by sea. It is impossible at this rate to disrupt Russia's ability to supply Crimea by sea. But they also have the land bridge, and they also have the physical Kerch bridge as of now. Even if they were to destroy the physical bridge and somehow manage to cut the land bridge, Russia would still be able to supply Crimea by sea by using not just this port here in Kerch, but there are a number of ports all along the Crimea Peninsula's coast. Ukraine, because its Western sponsors physically cannot provide enough missiles for Ukraine to use to attack and knock out these ports and also disrupt the shipping taking place between these ports and ports in the rest of Russia. They do not have enough missiles to do this. They cannot disrupt Russia's ability to supply Crimea by sea. This is just a fact. Now, they're conducting these attacks. It generates headlines, positive headlines for Ukraine. It's a propaganda effort. But in terms of strategically isolating Crimea, they're simply wasting long-range strike weapons that they do not have to spare. Now, let's get into these articles. First of all, let's start with the latest U.S. military assistance package. These are being sent about once a month. This is the most recent one. August 23rd, 2024, Biden administration announces additional security assistance for Ukraine. And if you are familiar with my updates, you will notice that these are almost exactly the same items that were on the previous list. And these are the exact items that have been showing up on each package every single month for many months now, since the so-called delay in funding and equipment took place over the course of several months. Let's take a look at the items on this list very briefly because they are the same items that were on the previous list. Let's just go over it. The first one is counter unmanned aerial systems, equipment and munitions. There are no specifics. This could range from machine guns mounted on vehicles with scopes that make it easier to target and shoot down drones, the ammunition that goes with these machine guns of various calibers. It could also be electronic warfare capabilities that the US is providing Ukraine. We don't know. What we do know is that both sides have anti-drone capabilities. Russia has many more and more effective capabilities in both terms of electronic warfare and in terms of physically shooting the drones down. Next on the list, ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS. These are multiple launch rocket systems. These guided rockets can also be fired by the M270 launch system. These launchers are in short supply. The rockets, at the current rate they are being sent to Ukraine, there is no real risk of running out of these rockets. The problem is there's not enough launchers to fire them. And even if you do fire them, there is the problem of Russia jamming them, intercepting them, and jamming them. And I'm just going to bring up this article again. This is from CNN. Russia's jamming of US-provided rocket systems complicates Ukraine's war effort. This was back in May 2023, last year. And it says here, Russia has been thwarting US-made mobile rocket systems in Ukraine more frequently in recent months, using electronic jammers to throw off its GPS-guided targeting system to cause rockets to miss their targets. And this has been ongoing, and this has affected all of the US, European-made precision-guided weapons that use GPS as part of their guided system. Next on the list, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery ammunition. The reason 105 millimeter artillery ammunition is being sent to Ukraine is because there's not enough 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. This is a problem that cannot be solved. Efforts to expand artillery shell production have failed. They are gradually increasing the rate of production, but it comes nowhere close to matching, let alone exceeding Russian production numbers, and it won't, not for years to come. Efforts to procure existing 155 millimeter stockpiles around the globe, we remember the so-called Czech initiative, this has also failed. And so Ukraine will simply continue suffering a deficiency in artillery ammunition. Most casualties are the result of artillery fire, meaning when we read reports in the Western media that somehow Russia is suffering more casualties than Ukraine, this is a product of wartime propaganda. This does not reflect the actual reality, the admitted reality of the disparity in arms and ammunition along the line of contact. Next on the list are two launched optically tracked wire-guided missiles. These are TOW missiles, anti-tank missiles, and the Javelin AT-4 anti-armor systems. All of these systems have been sent to Ukraine in huge quantities. Initially, thousands and thousands of these systems were sent to Ukraine. Stockpiles were exhausted. Now the United States is drawing from monthly production, and monthly production is not sufficient. We can go to Lockheed Martin's own website right here, ramping up Lockheed Martin, steadily increasing production of high demand systems. This was from February 2024. And among the munitions they're referring to is the Javelin anti-tank missile, 2,400 units per year. That works out to about 200 missiles a month. It's highly unlikely that all 200 missiles are being sent to Ukraine, but let's just assume that all 200 missiles are sent to Ukraine every single month. Every single one of these packages includes 200 Javelin anti-armor missiles. We remember this document here. This was put out by the US Army. Infantry Brigade Combat Team, Scout Platoon, anti-armor engagements at the Joint Readiness Training Center. If we go down here, it admits only about 19% were effective. They're talking about anti-tank engagements. And they're talking about registered hits, not kills, just hits. 19% of TOW missile, Javelin missile, AT-4 rounds, when they are fired at a target, an armored vehicle, 19% will hit, the rest will miss. And this was properly trained US soldiers using these weapons. Now, there are things that you can do to improve the hit rates, but that is for properly trained US Army soldiers, not Ukrainian conscripts that don't even have proper basic training. Out of 200 missiles per month, if all 200 were sent to Ukraine, we're talking about 38 missiles hitting a Russian armored vehicle every single month. And fewer than 38 would actually be destroyed, severely damaged or destroyed. The Western media, and I pointed this out many times, I've cited Western media before, admit that between main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, Russia is producing about 375 armored vehicles a month. So the United States is incapable of sending enough missiles to destroy Russian armor faster than Russia is able to manufacture and field it. That is just a reality. And then the rest of this list are odds and ends like high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, the Humvee ambulances, small arms ammunition, medical equipment, demolitions equipment and munitions, and spare parts, equipment, services, training, and transportation. So odds and ends, every army needs, every army has, including the Russian army, in quantities much greater than what Ukraine is receiving from the collective West. This is admitted. So another month, another assistance package featuring the same items drawn from monthly production, because the US does not make enough to build up large stockpiles. It's not make enough to supply Ukraine with what it needs to match, let alone exceed, Russian military industrial production. This is, in a way, an admission that the United States is incapable of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. What the US is doing is drawing this out for as long as possible, raising the cost for Russia as high as possible, but this is coming at the expense of Ukraine itself. And this brings us to what is happening on the battlefield. Now, I showed you the live map. Let's get into the articles from the Western media this past week detailing the fighting taking place in Kursk, but also in the Donbas region along the actual line of contact. So this Article from the New York Times, August 23rd. As Ukraine pushes into Russia, its next steps are unclear. Well, that is never a good sign if nobody knows what they're going to do next. American officials are not convinced that Ukraine intends to hold its position in Russia long term, because it's simply impossible for them to do so. If Russia decides to evict Ukraine, they will be evicted. If they cannot even hold their positions along a well-defended line of contact, they cannot hold their positions in a incursion inside Russian territory further from their logistics and other support networks. So what does the New York Times say? It says more than 2 weeks into Ukraine's incursion into Western Russia, Ukrainian politicians have begun talking about establishing a buffer zone there. But how much further Ukraine might try to advance into Russia and how long it plans to stay is unclear, U.S. officials said. So New York Times is citing various U.S. officials when they write this article. American officials are not convinced that Ukraine intends to hold its positions in Russia long term. Ukrainian forces have not been digging the kind of extensive trenches necessary to protect soldiers and equipment from enemy fire if Russia musters enough firepower to repel the attack. It's very important to keep this in mind. Remember this, this will be important later. The New York Times, citing U.S. officials, say Ukraine is not building the extensive defensive positions that they have along the actual line of contact. And also keep in mind that despite having those extensive defensive positions along the line of contact, Russia is still driving them back nonetheless. So keep all of that in mind. They have not been laying minefields to slow down a counterattack, nor have they constructed barriers to slow down Russian tanks, the officials say. Now, it's very important to keep in mind that doing this takes large amounts of resources, a dedicated unit to build these defenses. Yes, you can have your troops in the field build defenses. A lot of troops in the field have to build certain aspects of defensive positions, but Russia, for example, has entire military units. Their only job is building defensive positions. The Surovikin line, ahead of the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, that was built by dedicated military units. Their only task is building defenses along the line of contact. Tremendous resources, both in terms of trained manpower and equipment, construction material, that Ukraine simply does not have to spare, does not have to push into the Kursk region. The article also says, the more territory Ukraine captures, the greater the challenge it will be for some 10,000 Ukrainian troops there to defend it, U.S. officials and analysts said. There's a finite number of Ukrainian forces committed to Kursk. The more they spread out, the harder it will be for them to hold any of these positions, let alone all of these positions. And this is exactly what I had pointed out following the initial incursion. I said this was going to overextend Ukrainian forces, and it was going to accelerate the collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity. Now, this is exactly what the New York Times is admitting in this article. The article continues. It says it's had a shocking effect on the Russians. General Christopher Kavoli, NATO's top military commander, said last week at the Council on Foreign Relations, they're shocked by it. That won't persist forever. They'll gather themselves together and react accordingly. And we've seen Russia do this over and over again. First and foremost, we remember following the Ukrainian offensive in 2022, the Kherson and Kharkov offensive. Ukraine ended up losing, they ended up taking large amounts of territory, but they lost entire brigades doing it. And this has shaped the trajectory of the conflict ever since. That has damaged Ukrainian forces in a way they had never recovered from. Saying nothing of the damage the failed 2023 offensive inflicted. Ukraine's offensive so far has captured several settlements and one town in Russia. So when they say settlements, if you look at satellite images of these so-called settlements, sometimes it's a single road with 5 houses, 2 on one side, 3 on the other. This is considered a settlement, and that is what Ukraine is counting as one of the many settlements they claim that they have seized as part of this incursion. They've only managed to capture one actual town in Russia. But it has yet to fulfill a key goal drawing significant numbers of Russian units from eastern Ukraine. This was something that I had pointed out. As soon as the incursion took place, there were people claiming that the purpose of this incursion was to draw Russian forces away from the line of contact, force them to redeploy to Kursk, easing the pressure placed on Ukraine's crumbling defenses in the Donbas region. That wasn't going to happen, because the reason Ukrainian forces are crumbling in the first place is because Russia vastly outnumbers them. They outnumber them and they outgun them. They are essentially outfighting them. Ukraine taking what little it has along the line of contact and committing it to Kursk is overstretching Ukraine, not Russia. Russia has troops to spare to respond to that. We'll get into that in a little bit more details here in just a moment. Russia has sent mostly reserve units and troops from areas in southern and northeastern Ukraine that are not part of Moscow's main thrust toward the city of Pokrovsk. They also have enough forces that they can muster inside Russia itself to commit to Kursk. They're not in a huge rush to do this. The damage, the political damage, the PR damage has already been done. By diverting forces away from the line of contact, they're going to prolong the conflict taking place. They want to get this over as soon as possible. And they were willing to risk temporary, short-term political humiliation in Kursk to ensure long-term strategic success. This is what Russia has decided. Some American officials say that the more land Ukraine takes in Western Russia, the greater the risk of overextending its supply lines and air defense umbrella. This is obvious. And pushing more forces into Kursk creates weakness along the front lines in eastern Ukraine, especially in the Donbas region, where its forces are facing an intense Russian assault. So here's the New York Times now admitting that this has accelerated Russia's success in the Donbas region, and its success in the Donbas region equates to the increasing collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity. This is a gradual process. It's not going to just suddenly crumble overnight and disappear. It's something that is being eroded every day, every week, every month, year to year as this conflict continues. So we just saw US officials, according to the New York Times, admit that Ukraine is overextending itself in Kursk. At the moment, they're not even building extensive defenses to hold that territory. Then we have articles like this. In all of these articles, there's this component of wartime propaganda slipped in there to increase the amount of political damage. But if you read it carefully, you see them also admitting the strategic success in the long term this is granting Russia, especially the way they have decided to respond to this. So this is from the Business Insider. It says Russia is barely using one of its best weapons against Ukrainian forces in Kursk because it's scared to hit itself, war expert says. This was August 23rd, 2024. They're talking about glide bombs. And this is absolute nonsense. Let's get into this. Russia is unable to fully take advantage of one of its most effective weapons against Ukrainian forces advancing in its territory, military strategy expert said. That's likely because Russian systems aren't good enough to ensure that it won't hit itself, he said. And they're talking about Mark Kansian, a retired Marine Corps colonel and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, U.S. government arms industry funded think tank. This is nonsense. Russian glide bombs are effective precisely because they are very accurate. We have seen videos of them targeting tree lines, one bomb after the other, right along the tree line, striking the Ukrainian troops concealed there, dug in there. The point of using these glide bombs is to dislodge heavily defended positions along the line of contact. We just saw the New York Times admit that those positions do not exist in Kursk. Therefore, there is no need for Russia to use glide bombs extensively. This same article admits that indeed Russia is using glide bombs, just not extensively. The New York Times already told us why, because there are no extensive defense positions in Kursk, in this area Ukraine has moved into in Kursk. So it's very important to very carefully analyze the news coming out of the collective West to try to figure out what is actually happening under these layers of wartime propaganda. And you can see that the truth is clearly there. but you have to use analysis to arrive at that truth. Now, highlighting the progress Russia is making along the actual line of contact, we have this article from CNN. Parents hide children from mandatory evacuations as Ukraine says Russia advancing fast on key cities. So now we're seeing all these articles about Pokrovsk being evacuated, the inevitability of Russia taking this key logistics hub, military and logistics hub along Ukraine's line of contact, their defensive lines. The CNN article says communities in and around Pokrovsk are being urged to flee within the next 2 weeks as Russian forces push forward, which comes despite Ukraine's own incursion into Russian territory that has taken Moscow by surprise. I would say probably not despite, but precisely because it was Russian forces were going to arrive there sooner or later. The incursion into Kursk guaranteed that it happened sooner rather than later. Russia insisted it had thwarted another Ukrainian attempt to push into the border region of Bryansk. So Ukraine has pushed into Kursk. They have repeatedly tried to push into Bryansk and also Belgorod, but unsuccessfully. As Ukraine continues to make advances into the Kursk region, well, we've seen these advances. It has slowed down significantly, and the area that they're trying to push into is an area they themselves are isolating from Russian forces by destroying bridges, which means once they take that last pocket of territory, if they take that last pocket of territory, by destroying the bridges, they have guaranteed that they themselves are not going to be able to advance any further than that. Roughly 600 to 700 people have been evacuating daily. So every single day, people are being evacuated. This is according to the administration there. The National Rail Network said at least 371 people evacuated from Pokrovsk by train, with the network having added 9 carriages to accommodate the large crowd. So there is a rail hub there. And this is another reason why it is important. Then the CNN article says, don't wait, it will not get better, it will only get worse, leave. This was the stark warning from local official Yuri Tretiak, head of the military administration in Nirmograd, which is now less than 3 miles from the front line. And again, as to why Pokrovsk is important, CNN says, Pokrovsk is not a large city. About 60,000 people lived there before the war, and many have left since the start of the full-scale invasion, but it serves as a key hub for the Ukrainian military thanks to its easy access to Konstantinivka, another military center. So whereas Ukraine is pushing into Kursk, and daily analysis by Alexander Mikuris and Alex Christoforou at the Duran, and also throughout the week by Mark Sloboda, they have repeatedly pointed out the nature of the terrain in Kursk. It is forests with very small settlements scattered throughout it, very few towns, let alone cities. This area that Ukraine has pushed into, they picked it precisely because there is nothing there, and it would have been easiest to push into this area. Not because of any strategic importance it has. As a matter of fact, the only location of strategic value in Kursk is the Kursk nuclear power plant. That was the closest strategic objective, possible strategic objective, near where Ukraine committed its troops. So whereas Ukraine is pushing into this area of no strategic value, its incursion culminating now, admittedly, Russia is taking towns and cities and locations along the line of contact that will contribute to the next phase of grinding down Ukraine's defense lines, which means also grinding down Ukraine's fighting capacity. As a war of attrition, a strategy of attrition, this is what Russia has been doing, and this is why they have been having success. Now, considering all that is unfolding, according to the Western media itself, the New York Times, CNN, and if you read between the lines of that Business Insider article, considering everything that they themselves are admitting to, consider articles like this. Again, a heavy element of wartime propaganda. Ukraine's march into Russia exposes Putin's crisis management problem. And what this article is trying to do is seize upon the public relations and political damage the Kursk incursion has done, while ignoring the long-term strategic success Russia has kept in focus throughout the duration of this incursion. So this is what the article says. Russia's President Vladimir Putin likes to project himself as a strongman, but his track record of handling recent crises in Russia reveals a different side of his presidential persona, one of paralysis and indecision. But considering how events are unfolding now, following the Kursk incursion, the acceleration of Russia's advance in the Donbas region, the fact that the Western media is questioning this strategic wisdom of what Ukraine is even doing in Kursk, does this really seem like a product of paralysis and indecision? This decision to mobilize reserves, Russian forces within Russia itself, troops that can be spared from elsewhere, instead of taking battle-hardened units off the line of contact, remaining focused on advancing along the line of contact and grinding down Ukraine's military power. This represents Russia, Moscow, resisting an emotional, politically motivated attempt to try to save face in the short term and stay focused on strategic success in the long term. And the CNN article even admits that despite Russia being unprepared to stop this incursion, it admits that there are now signs of a more coordinated resistance. Russia is moving beyond the initial knee-jerk response phase, and it should start to look more organized in the days and weeks ahead. And this is what Russia has done all along. Instead of overreact politically, emotionally, they react objectively, strategically, patiently, even if it means losing face in the short term. Suffering political damage in the short term, they do what is necessary to succeed strategically in the long term. They have done this all throughout their military intervention in Syria from 2015 onward, and that is exactly how they have been conducting the special military operation. Now, the article ends by arguing that Russia's red lines are irrelevant, the West should disregard them, Russia hasn't resorted to using nuclear weapons because of the incursion into Kursk, has not retaliated for the use of Western weapons during the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. This isn't representative of Russia having red lines that it refuses to uphold. This is Russia showing restraint and patience, and it is reserving the many options it has to escalate. And there are many options to escalate long before it ever has to come down to using nuclear weapons. An adversary that is showing restraint and patience is not an adversary that is weak and incapable of responding. So this is the wrong conclusion to draw from what Russia has done in response to the incursion into Kursk. Again, when you read the Western media itself admit that despite the initial morale boost, the public relations and political damage that it has caused, it has actually become a liability for Ukraine, not for Russia. In the long term, this suits Russia. It has overextended Ukrainian forces, and it has accelerated the advance of Russian forces along the actual line of contact. When you actually think about it, politics and emotions aside, strategically, this has worked out much better for Russia than it has for Ukraine. And much of what Ukraine has done throughout the special military operation has worked much in the same way. And now we even see the Western media citing Western officials, US officials even, admitting that Kursk is basically a liability for Ukraine. So this is the political and strategic position that Ukraine and its Western sponsors are in, as well as Russia. This was very predictable when the incursion into Kursk began. It was very clear that this was going to overextend Ukraine's forces. If you have been following this closely all along, you will know that Ukraine does not have enough manpower, they do not have enough weapons, they do not have enough ammunition, they do not even have enough to hold what they have, let alone take additional territory from Russia. Everything that they have done is simply overextended themselves and accelerated the collapse of their fighting capacity even more. I want to, however, warn everyone about the possibility of a US/NATO intervention. This has always been a danger from the very beginning. The United States is not just going to pack up and go home if Ukraine begins to collapse. We saw the US do the same thing in Syria. Their proxies in Syria were on the verge of collapse. The US intervened. They took Syrian territory east of the Euphrates River, and they're still there even to this day. That intervention by the US drew out the proxy war. The proxy war still continues in one way or another to this day. It is far from over. Syria, with the help of Russia and Iran, has essentially prevailed. But it's going to be a long, painful process to evict both the US and Turkey from what remains of occupied territory in Syria. The same painful, long and painful process lies ahead for Ukraine. Some people might say, well, what about Afghanistan? The US withdrew from Afghanistan. It is out of Afghanistan, but we have to remember that the US withdrew from Afghanistan specifically to concentrate its resources and attention on a much larger, more dangerous conflict, the proxy war it was preparing against Russia in Ukraine. If the US were to abandon Ukraine, it would only be to pursue a much larger and more dangerous conflict elsewhere. Perhaps a conflict in the Middle East against Iran. That seems to be a continuous possibility. And of course, America's primary geopolitical obsession is encircling and containing China. They're building up toward a large-scale military confrontation against China off China's own coasts. If the US were to withdraw from its proxy war in Ukraine, it would only be to consolidate its resources to focus on a much larger conflict like that against China, which would still be a huge threat to Russia ultimately. The fates of Russia, China, Iran, and the rest of the multipolar world are all connected. What happens to one of these nations is going to affect the rest of them. We have to always keep that in mind. The actual battle taking place right now is between US-led unipolar hegemony and an emerging multipolar world, an emerging balance of power globally. So let's keep all of that in mind. We have to keep an eye on all of these conflicts that are all connected to one another. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description are all of the links to the resources I cited in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. Everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no extra resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.